Hello, everyone. I'm happy to introduce our guest and our friend, Nikola Zizele. He is a co-founder of French architectural agency called COS Architects, which focuses on wood buildings and has projects all around the world. And he's also a lecturer at Lille, Abidjan Schools of Architecture. And this September, Nicolas came to visit Ukraine as the co-organizer of architectural workshop dedicated to integration of children into playground design. Okay, so first question. This is your first visit to Kyiv and Ukraine in general. Can you please share initial emotions and what perhaps immediately impressed or shocked you about the city?
Thank you, Anastasia, and добрый день, everybody. My first impression of it's a very emotional journey. It's a very long journey, so you get a lot of preparations. You enter a different time scale than we are used to in the sort of bustling life that we have in Paris and Europe in general. You suddenly slow down a bit, look a bit more around, and also get this
slow down. To slow down.
Yeah, you slow down a bit, and you discover also this impression that Ukraine is so big. This is something I wasn't prepared to. I enter another dimension of landscapes. You are really entering something that is quite impressive. And I think that is also what was surprising for me in Kyiv. I mean, like everybody, I had Googled the city to look a bit where things were. I didn't realize the scale of the city, how big it is, how wide it is, how high some buildings are. I didn't realize the geography. So it's really interesting to see that once again, that all the tools that we have, that we think we know everything because we have all this digital help, doesn't replace the real impression. And what also was pretty impressive is that how the city is calm and silent.
Wow. I would never say this about Kyiv.
Well, for me, it was, I really felt that it was rather, I don't know, maybe it was the day I arrived because it was a Saturday, but I found it very calm, very peaceful in a way. Not aggressive like a lot of big cities of this scale that I know. Probably less aggressive than Paris, for instance.
Okay, that's very interesting. And did you feel any fear of the war when you were coming to Kyiv, like before you were coming to Kyiv, and maybe you changed your perception in general about the situation and the country after your visit?
I knew I thought it was going to be more present, to be honest. I thought that it was going to be, I was, for instance, I've been a few times in the Middle East, in Israel, where you have, I mean, half of the population is soldiers, and you have soldiers everywhere with arms in the street. I had the feeling I was going to find, again, the same sort of imbrication between civil and military in public space, which I didn't have this feeling at first. So, of course, there are all these signs of war, the checkpoints, the military checkpoints, all these metal systems to block the streets, things like that. But I didn't know, and I didn't have any fear before coming. I mean, because I was coming to join all this wonderful team from Kyiv that were so strong and confident. So what was the risk?
Okay, that's good to hear.
Yes, and also maybe something that is very different is, of course, before crossing the border, my knowledge was mainly a lot of knowledge comes from the news, where you have all this sort of geostrategical information. And it's obviously quite different when you are on the ground, when you are really with people, talking to them, and you go from having a perception of the country and the city from this sort of very broad news level to the more human level. And that's also makes a very, very big change.
Yeah, I definitely agree. How was the experience of the war in Kyiv in general? Maybe you noticed some changes in the urban environment in terms of the war, not like curfew hour or air raids, but something more about changes like in architecture, which is a bit unusual to see from the sites. And maybe you think it might affect the future developments of the urban spaces in Kyiv and like social integration.
Of course, there is one thing that is immediately appearing, which is all the protection that is put around official buildings, around the statues, all the blockades that make the city sometimes a real mess, because you just have to go around a protected area. I think that what is the most impressive for us when you come, and that is probably the most changing in terms of urban space, is all the memorials to the fallen ones that you see in all the city, in a really all very different types of how it is shown, but all these photographs of the soldiers who died, with the biography or the memory that is being built, is really something super impressive, and that is completely changing the perception of public space and the use of it. I mean, the way that people react in these big places where it is, and it's certainly a big question for the future of how to because all this now is a bit temporary, but how do you keep it? How do you keep it alive, and also hopefully get into the next great step for Ukraine and Kiev, which is being part of Europe. So really how to make this permanent, but also with this not making it a monument. I think that's what's impressive, is that it's not a monument. It's not like in France, in every village, you have this monument for the fallen of the Great Wars. But there are these sort of very official monuments where you always have the soldier going to the front and the children in the back and things like that. That's all these sort of sculptures. And this here, it's really something completely different. There's really something about the relation you have with really the people that you see are dead. And this is something for me very, very impressive. And I think that something has to be thought about how to keep it. What's also impressive is that of course, in Kyiv, you have a lot of big ones of them. And then coming back, I realized that in a lot of smaller cities, it also exists. So it's really something that is in all the places around Ukraine, and there certainly has to be a big reflection in terms of what to do with that to maintain it and to make it a really important part of local and national identity.
That's a very interesting point, because yeah, I definitely didn't think in this perspective. Okay, now let's talk more about urbanism. Go away from the painful topics. Okay, in my opinion, Kyiv is a very atypical and unique, maybe European city in terms of the architecture and urbanism, and especially when compared to other cities and capitals in Western Europe, where like urban planning and patterns that tend to overlap and repeat sometimes. But I acknowledge that my opinion can be a bit biased. As I was born and raised here, it's kind of my city and it's special for me. But maybe you can name some European cities or cities around the world that reminded you of Kyiv, and maybe they can also serve as partially the strategy for more sustainable development of the city, like the models for Kyiv.
Yeah, that's a big it's a big question. It's funny because of the history and the way that it was made, there are certain aspects of Kiev that are a bit Latin in the way that I know the cities of mostly of Southern Europe, but it's definitely not a Latin city. There is something, of course, related to let's say the Middle Europa. I think you would find more examples of it brings back more examples of some German cities. I mean, it's a bit crazy because it looks like a bit a collage city in some way. Like you have almost the harbor of Rotterdam next to a bit of Helsinki, with some part of East Berlin next to it. In terms of size, that's pretty interesting. So I think it more relates to this type of city. So probably a good. There's also one city that that I went to that I immediately related to Kiev, but that would be a smaller Kiev, which is Belgrade.
Okay.
In Serbia, which has also this same sort of incredible confrontation between this. There's also the river. There's also this sort of this area of the housing blocks from the 50s to the 80s, the historic part, and all of this collapsing next to each other, sort of collage of different things. So and then in terms of sustainable example, of course, I mean, obviously looking at what is happening in Berlin would be a good benchmark. Probably also very strangely looking at Copenhagen is a pretty good benchmark, even if it's has absolutely nothing to do in terms of landscape, because Copenhagen is flat and Kiev is a lot of hills. But these are cities where you have this same sort of issue between the proximity of historic park, of more recent developments starting from the 90s, 2000s, all the urban sprawl, a bit the passage from the housing blocks to the houses that are more in the garden. I mean, there's a lot of sort of similarities with a lot of differences, but it's probably interesting to look a bit at the cities as benchmarks to what could be done. I would probably also look at what is happening in the Baltic states. The cities are much smaller, like Vilnius or Riga or Tallinn, much smaller. But there is also a shared heritage of history that has made these cities, and the way that they are trying also to get to a more sustainable level is probably interesting. It's probably also interesting and inspiring in terms of public policies. I mean, not only in terms of what is built, what happens, and let's say hardware strategies, but also all the strategies that are developed by the city councils. I think there are interesting relationships that could be partnerships that could be made on this level, because there are a lot of issues in terms of being a more sustainable city that are exactly the same.
Yes, definitely. Coming from the similar background, especially
preservation of heritage, having maybe 60 to 80% of the population which is still living in Soviet era blocks that have posed enormous sustainable issues. Having had this first stage of investment that has made the sprawls of CBDs and sort of strange high rises that are sometimes half empty.
Yes.
I mean, there's a lot of similarities, and it could be interesting to see how they are coping with it and what they are doing with it in terms of sustainability, and also in terms of alignment with, let's say, the European green criteria.
That's very interesting. Thank you very much. And now I will ask the opposite question, because in the context of mass globalization of the cities and how modern architecture looks absolutely alike, and sometimes you can't differ, like modern areas from Paris and Dubai, maybe not Paris and Dubai, but okay, some cities in America and, for example, Dubai. What did you notice in Kyiv that vividly reflects its identity. Perhaps like someone with the fresh perspective, because we are, as the citizens, sometimes don't see what we have in front of us. Maybe you observe certain elements in the urban environment and architecture that embody the spirit of the city and what makes Kyiv to be Kyiv, and what we as the citizens definitely have to preserve to save this identity of the city.
I have a special way of trying to understand the city, which is I always focus on food.
On food?
Yeah, that's I mean, for me, the identity of the city is always a bit related to food and to how it shapes well, how people live and urban space. So in this regard, there's always interesting things to say. One thing that is interesting is all the presence of the kiosks and how a lot of people go to them, which is when we were there, weather was still fine. I'm pretty curious to see if there is still this sort of social activity around the kiosk where people meet who are working in different offices or places. They meet to take a coffee together. This sort of does it still happen in winter? That's a real question I'm asking myself. And also, it was interesting because you have them all over the city. I mean, you have them in the central historic city, but I also saw that in most areas a bit far, you always find one or two of them. Sometimes they're related to a gas station or things like that. But yeah, I find that these social food eating hubs are something pretty interesting.
Well, to be fair, our government is now trying to fight with them and demolish and put them into like a ground level of the buildings.
Yeah, I suppose this is a super bad decision because it's really part of the life of the city. I really felt that to use everywhere. There's always like a bunch of people who are at least taking a coffee. There's also this incredible coffee culture.
Oh.
I mean, I've never seen people so obsessed with coffee. So many coffee shops everywhere in all the shapes. So this is really something. So this is also really something that to preserve. I mean, to encourage and to develop these sort of pop-up coffees that you have everywhere. There's one thing, but I don't know if it's the normal Kyiv or if it's related to the situation. I found that people are very caring between each other. I saw a lot of situations where you have somebody who seems a bit distressed or whatever, and you immediately have a few people crossing the road to just come see what's happening, take him or her by the hand somewhere. So I don't know if this is the usual way, but I found this sort of caring attitude in the streets very important, and also something, I guess, if the government wants to take away the kiosks, the other thing that I found very touching is also they probably don't like it that much. Is also a lot of old people who are setting small informal kiosks a bit everywhere, just selling maybe 3 flowers, 4 apples, or whatever, a sort of way of elderly people who live in semi-autonomous lives in the outskirts of the city. I don't know if it provides them subsistence or if it's just for socializing, but they come to the city and they sort of make a presence, a human presence in a city that has so many wide areas that could appear a bit monumental, impressive, and empty.
Mm-hmm.
And once again, you have these people and there's always somebody chatting with them. So this is also something very pretty interesting, I think.
Okay, so it's more about the social involvement of the city and how like people more act.
Yeah. Then there is then of course it's I mean, we didn't go in all the city, and I would be really curious to see also if I would also like to go to the other river side of the Dnieper river.
That's what we definitely missed. Yeah.
in the new areas to see how people live there, because it seems that there's also a closer relationship there between these sort of big residential areas and this sort of smaller, I don't know, small gardens with summer houses or weekend houses. This sort of relationship with seems to be a bit more direct. And the east and on the western part of the city also, what is happening, you have these avenues with all these housing blocks. What is happening in between the housing blocks, I'd be pretty curious to see, to have a more detailed approach to that, obviously.
Okay, next time
And there is also something, sorry, and there is also something, of course, we spent a lot of time in the historical part of Kyiv, which is super lively. I mean, it's the number of bars, of venues, of restaurants is incredible. The way that the way that there is that you can also have this sort of shortcuts crossing the blocks by passageways. You go under a building, then you go in a courtyard, another courtyard. You arrive. Keeping this sort of crisscrossing of the city with outside of the streets is also something I think to really keep. Because in a lot of European cities, and for instance in Paris, this is for me one of the biggest loss in Paris. It's now all the entrance to the courtyards are closed with a code, and like you cannot
private
have
areas. Yeah.
Yes, and you don't have this experience of this sort of semi-public life that happens, and that is I think a place where a lot of things can develop and happen.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, because I think in terms of planning, just in general, Kyiv is a bit chaotic, and especially like the central area, which is mixture of Soviet Union, like Empire, Russian Empire architecture, and just like creates this weird tunnels between the streets. Okay, let's shift to a more green topic. There is an interesting fact. 60 years ago, Charles de Gaulle visited Kyiv. He commented that he had seen many parks in the cities, but for the first time he saw a city in a park. Many years have passed, and Kyiv definitely changed a lot and been heavily built up, but does this feeling still remains in the city? Would you say that Kyiv is green or more on the concrete side now?
Well, I think Charles de Gaulle...
Be honest.
Yeah.
I think like...
No.
Yeah.
First, Charles de Gaulle, I think he had a way of anytime he went somewhere, he had to make a sentence on a definition of the place he went, and a few of them are pretty fucked up. And they were mostly things that he said from a sort of aerial point of view. I think he really wrote these things before landing in the city. There is one of the great examples is, outside of Paris, he sort of promoted this idea of making new polarization of cities. And the story goes that it happened because he was in a helicopter coming from the airport, and he said to the guy next to him, put me some order in that mess. So he was this sort of guy. And I guess that even today, when you land by plane, you probably have this feeling that Kyiv is a city inside the, I think we wouldn't say a city inside a park. We would say a city inside a forest, because that's more what it is. That makes this feeling, the proximity of the forest, which is really very close to the city. You have a lot of very natural forests, all these pine forests around that have a huge presence. So yeah, I would say that probably from a very large perspective, you still have this feeling. It's less so on the ground, let's be honest. There's a lot of green spaces in the city, and pretty huge green spaces, to be honest. They're really impressive. But the city, I wouldn't call it a green city because there's lacking a bit this level of green and nature on the street level. There's I mean, all the huge avenues with no trees. There's yeah, there could be a lot of very easy improvement to making it a real green city. And yeah, of course, Kyiv is cold in the winter, but we also saw that even in the beginning of autumn, it can be pretty hot, and it's probably going to get even hotter in the next decades with climate change.
Definitely.
So and obviously the heat island effect is probably going to raise in the city, also because there's because all the city has not really been, all the buildings have not really been made to cope with high episodes of temperature. And we know that obviously planting trees in all the streets is the first step to be able to mitigate this climate rise, and also to probably also help something else, which is heavy rain, which the rest of Europe experienced at the same time we were experiencing hot in Kyiv. But all this issue about having more plain ground in the city to prevent flooding is also probably going to be an issue. So there is probably a reflection, and that's also the big luck regarding the city I live in Paris, where everything is a bit narrow. That's also the big luck of having so wide public space that it's pretty easy to transform that into to give 50%, which is just for plants and trees, while keeping it big enough for the people and also for the traffic.
Yes, definitely.
And then there's also something to do, but this is really a long-term planning, or maybe it's going to be short-term if prices rise of oil. It's that public transport has surely got to be improved.
No one will argue with this.
It's still a city, or because of its size and because of the fact that things are pretty far apart, it's pretty hard to move without a car in the city in a very efficient way. And once again, having the opportunity of having these very large avenues is probably a great opportunity to develop high-speed, high capacity transit systems or public transit systems. I mean, another city that had the same issue is Mexico City. I mean, and the way that a few of these big avenues have now been 50% of the place is for these high transit buses, changes completely the way that you live in the city.
No, definitely, because it's the massive problem now with the cars, constant traffics, and especially I would say that since the war, the full scale started, the city, there's a lot of internally displaced people in Kyiv now, and it feels like the number of cars increased right now compared to what was before the war and what was in the beginning of the war. And it's just sometimes unbearable. Like, you would just rather not go anywhere or only walk, because you would never get anywhere by public transport, and the car is just going to take you ages.
We spent quite a few time on a few bridges looking at these traffic jams that are really not moving, to the point that people have gone out of their cars to look what is happening. So this is the sign that something has to be done.
Exactly.
And then there's also, of course, well, as a Parisian, I move around mainly by bicycle. So there's also something to be done there. Probably, I mean, because of the hills, electric assistance is a lifesaver in Kyiv, even if I saw a lot of people on regular bikes with a lot of speeds. But I mean, on a day-to-day basis, it's probably a bit discouraging when it starts raining and snowing. Yeah, but it probably could be developed. And what's interesting with the scale of the city is to imagine developing it in relationship to public transport, to make it easy to take a bike on a high capacity bus And so you sort of hop from one mode of transit to the other. So there's probably a big reflection that could be done to it. I saw, it's always very, very funny because when you have cities that start, and the city, I mean, seems to start to encourage bicycling. And it's interesting because usually the people who are in charge of the roads, they always think in terms of car traffic, and they tend to reproduce at the size of a bike all the urban, all the traffic, the way that you make roads for cars. And I took a few pictures of very strange ways of thinking that bicycles will react like it in the street, like you have to go around to cross and things like that, which don't really take into consideration what is the great pleasure of being in the bicycle in the city, which is more or less this freedom to go like you want. So they are learning, and that's pretty, and I mean, we had the same, and what's interesting is that they are doing it a bit the same way as most big cities are doing it, with a more or less, not tactical urbanism way, but a bit these sort of tools of having more or less light systems of to make the bike lanes that would be kept or not kept. This way of being incremental is also interesting and probably can be used citywide.
Okay. And yeah, we were talking about Dnipro. And yeah, let's talk about our main river of the country. As we've spent a few days of working on the banks of Dnipro River, and you had the chance to feel its power and how massive it is. But in my opinion, a lot of urbanists, river is absolutely poorly integrated into the city scale, and like citizens can't really use the river coast, which I think is a bit stupid from us and from the government not to deal with this anyhow. What's maybe development strategy for Dnipro riverfront would you recommend? And maybe like some examples from the outside.
Yeah, Dnipro River is a huge chance for the city. It's I mean, you don't know if it's a river, a lake, a sea. It's so huge. It's absolutely amazing. It's when you discover it. The first days we were in Kyiv, we didn't see the river, and the moment you discover it, you realize that there is it's absolutely incredible in terms of size. And what's interesting is that there's a lot of cities with big rivers, but that are just big rivers. Like the issue is that you have to cross the river, which is really big. So it takes a long time. Here, what is fascinating is all the presence of the islands and all the potential that they offer in terms of recreational spaces and what can be done with them. And they are probably underused because the access to the islands is not so easy. In fact, I mean, there's not a metro, if I'm correct, there's not a metro station on the islands. It's on each part, and each time you have to cross to go there. So this is something that could be improved. Then there is something that's absolutely obvious. And I mean, I had the feeling I was back in Paris 20 years ago, which is the sort of urban highway on the banks of the river. This is I mean, if there was one thing to change in Kyiv, it would probably be this, because you can see there's maybe just one moment, a very small moment at the level of the American University where you have this really natural connection between the high city going down and arriving by a public space to the river. And this should be everywhere. This is such huge potential. Obviously, when you see how much it is used today, except if the city of Kyiv wants to have a public revolution, it would not be wise to decide to shut it down from tomorrow. But I think what would be interesting, what's interesting is I have really two examples of cities who managed to tackle this presence of an urban highway inside a city, and it's a 10-year work to change mentalities and to be able to get rid of the cars. Of course, one of them is Paris, where we had all the banks of the River Seine were a highway. And there was a super strong opposition to put the cars out of it because it's going to bring all the traffic in the city, blah, blah, blah. And the city made it very incrementally. The first thing they did was making a festival called Paris Plage, which was shutting this highway only for 1 month in the summer. And making it a place where you had temporary swimming pools, places to do tennis, basketball, volleyball, beach volley, temporary pop-up bars. You had an enormous amount of offer of activities there for just 1 month, and maybe they did it for 10 years. And after that, at some point, they said, now we are going to take the cars away permanently.
Wow, that's a very interesting strategy.
It was very, very well. There were a lot of other steps, but this idea that you make the people experiment what it is like to enjoy the city without the cars, and you will see that it changes a lot. So Paris made it on this idea of doing it one month in the summer. And then there is another incredible example, which is São Paulo in Brazil, where there was a raised urban highway in the middle of the city. And they did it differently. They shut it to traffic every Sunday. And it was just shut to traffic, and they let people do whatever they wanted there. And it was more seeing how people were using it for having parties between neighbors, people running and things like that. And they more or less built the transformation of the use of this place from what the people were doing during these days and to making it more permanent. And I think now that the highway has been almost shut to traffic, to traffic, or maybe it's reduced, or I don't know exactly. But I think these are two tactical ways because the lack of connection between the high city and the bank of the river with this incredible green park on the slope is really the point to tackle.
No, definitely. We kind of have had before the war the similar strategy. I don't know if I can call it, for Hreśćatek, the main street of the city, which was also closed during the Sundays fully and used by people. But I don't think anyone was actually trying to change Hreśćatek, but it was still nice because for at least 1 day in a week, you could just enjoy walking on the street as it should be. Walkable and for pedestrians, not this massive highway in the middle of the city.
Yeah, but I don't know, maybe I mean probably every city is different, and I guess that this highway along the bank is probably used a lot by is it really necessary in terms of connections from the south to the north of the city. But then once again, probably, and this was the same in Paris. On the river, it was used for connections through the city. It was not used for getting into the city. And so it's interesting to think also in terms of that. And that's also where certainly developing a regional public transport. Like, I mean, you could just have maybe one lane. One of the idea, for instance, in Paris on the ring around Paris is that progressively, the place for the cars is going to shrink. So they made the experiment during the Olympic Games where one of the lanes was reserved only for the teams, the Olympic officials and things like that. So shrinking the place for the cars. And they have the intention the next years to have one lane that becomes only for public transport and things like that. And then the second step is again one lane less, which is going to be for bicycles and pedestrians. So there's this idea of shrinking the place of the car, which means also that the cars will go slower, and that you transform this sort of highway into a regular street.
Yeah, and it also kind of forces people to realize that it's much harder to get somewhere by the car than by public transport. That's what I experienced in London as well, that it's just extremely expensive. It's impossible to get anywhere by car, so you just choose the public transport because it's easier, faster, and probably now cheaper as well.
Yeah. And having a car is a huge cost now for a household.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think one thing that cities should be able to provide, it's not exactly the 15-minute city, because you can still take transport for half an hour to go someplace. But having half an hour in the public transport is not the same as spending 2 hours in a traffic jam to do the same thing.
Exactly. Okay, to conclude, you talked about the overall impression, but maybe you want to say more words about Kyiv and how it welcomed you and its people, and when are you planning to come soon?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's almost a second home now. It's really a city, very welcoming city. Same thing. People are incredible. It's very easy to engage with people. There's an incredible vibe. It's also a very young city. There's really a city where the young people are really taking it over in a way.
I also started feeling it. I think it wasn't like this even 10 years ago. It just became like recently like a boom of youth in Kyiv.
Yeah, that's so this is this is always very promising to have a city like that. And yeah, well, I would like to come as soon as possible, back as soon as possible. That's
we're waiting for you as soon as possible.
That's really for sure. And also to experience it in different moments of the year, because it's to see how the weather, how the temperature, climate changes the way that you experience a city, which is always something super interesting for us professionals of cities.
Yes, definitely, and we have kind of like vivid seasons in the city. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. It was very interesting conversation. Also very promising, because I think we tend to shit on the city quite a lot as citizens on all of the problems. But yeah, it's nice to hear that it's not that bad. That there are still things to love and enjoy.
Yeah, it's a pretty lovable city. It's also no, there's also something that has to be said. It's that because it's also a city in transformation, going probably from a very industrial moment to now that has a lot of available space in the city to develop things. This is also a great opportunity. I mean, a lot of things can be tested very easily in the city. Probably less administrative authorizations to gain to test things like the place with this ping pong bar, which is, I mean, making the set, which is really in the center of the city. In a place like Paris, in a lot of European cities, you can find this sort of strange places happening, but they are not going to be in the center. They're going to be a bit outside, because this is because all the center is already too dense, too congested, and you don't have too valued, and you don't have the potential to try something without investing a lot in it. And so that's also something that I think should be thought, that maybe not looking at the empty spaces in the city as something to be valued on a real estate point of view, but something to be valued on what it allows all the people to propose, try. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work. Maybe it grows, maybe it stays like it is. To keep this potential of evolution, of organic evolution of the city.
Actually, it's interesting because, for example, you mentioned the ping pong place and the table tennis bars in one spot, and it's been there only since the war started. So they opened like 2 years ago. So it's absolutely new, but it became so popular. Like it's insane now, constantly. Like so many people are coming there. And it's like a hub now in Kiev, which is so young.
Yeah, that's great because I mean, it's done with, I mean, it's not done with a lot of money, obviously. And that's also the great thing, that it was easy to start. It's being improved step by step. And it becomes a real place for everybody. I mean, in a city like Paris, you would have the same thing, except it would be, you would have to have a membership for it of X euros per month, or the entrance would be, because of the renting of the space would be so expensive that you cannot do something lightly like this. And this also, of course, impacts also the relationship between the people who run this sort of places and those who come. Because if you really need each customer to spend a lot of money just to pay the rent, it's not the same as having this sort of friendly welcoming. And that's really something important in the city, to be welcomed as a friend, wherever, a real friend, wherever you go.
Okay, yeah, that's nice to hear. Okay, thank you very much for this amazing interview.
Thank you, Anastasia. And yeah, see you soon.
See you very soon in Kyiv, hopefully.
In Kyiv.
And in Vinnytsia.
And Vinnytsia, of course.